My name is Jessica Pierce, and I will be your host today. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on understanding adolescent brain development in teen dating violence cases. We know that the adolescent brain develops differently than the adult brain, and or develops into the adult brain, I guess I should say. And kids make decisions differently than we do. And so really having a grounding in adolescent brain development helps us understand all of the decisions kids make, and especially in things like intimate relationships, they're going to be making choices that don't always make sense to adults. And so we're excited to be talking about teen dating violence within this context. We're also very excited to have with us Dr. Claire Crooks, who has a Ph.D. in psychology, and I think probably spends more time than anyone else thinking about how these connections between that adolescent brain development really does affect adolescent behavior. We are a grant-funded project, so this today does not represent any official positions of the federal government. Just need to make sure I say that. As I said, my name is Jessica Pierce, and I'm joined by Claire Crooks. And we have funding from the Office of Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance on the topic of teen dating violence. And so as we're going through today's webinar, if you have questions and you're thinking about how this could affect your own practice within your own jurisdiction, I do encourage you to contact NCJ FCJ to ask for additional services and supports. We do have a little bit of funding to do like even some direct work with your court. And then we also have access to a ton of different resources and things that we can provide to you. All right, so now that you know a little bit about us and the project, I would love to get to know all of you, and we do have a couple of poll questions to find out who's joining us in the audience today. So the first question is, of course, what is your position in the courts? We did kind of try to do some pretty generalized topics here, so try to pick the one that's the closest to what you do. And if you feel like it's really not there, you can go ahead and type something in chat as well. And you'll notice we do have our chat open. We also have the Q&A activated for this webinar. So if you have just specific questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. We do have 169 people right now on the participant count. So if you put questions into chat, they might get lost with lots of other people. So if you do have a question, do specifically put that in our Q&A. All right, let's go ahead and end this poll, and everybody can see the answers. So it looks like we kind of have a pretty good split between judges and preventative service folks. Those are kind of the biggest, but we're also representing probation and law enforcement. We have some advocates with us, and then some general court staff. And I'm going to take a peek over here at chat and see what else people are putting in. Okay, we've got some mediators, we've got educators, social work. So lots of folks that are doing a little bit of everything here. So that's great. Let's talk about who else let's talk about a little bit more about all of you. So our next question is to find out sort of how much experience you have working with juveniles engaged in dating violence. This is one of those topic areas where it's hard to figure out where these kids end up in the system because it depends a lot on how statutes are written, how kids come to the attention of court. And so sometimes teens who are in a dating relationship may not come to court as a dating violence sort of situation if they get into a fight. It can sometimes come in as sort of like, you know, a simple assault sort of thing that's happening. Sometimes it comes into the civil court. And in some jurisdictions, you know, you're not going to see a lot of this. And so, again, where it falls is really dependent on where you're at. So we're really curious about that. And it's actually one of the things that we're trying to create a national picture of with this project is where teen dating violence ends up and how courts address it. So I appreciate you guys answering this question. That helps us build our technical assistance portfolio for you. And let's go ahead and take a look at the results. So we do have kind of half and half between those first two, almost no experience and some experience, kind of being on that low end of things. And then we do have some folks that have moderate experience or lots of experience. And again, you know, that where we're not even really screening for it or not necessarily coming to the attention of the court, or maybe some screening and some recognition, that's not a surprise because again, things, you know, are so different all across the country. And this is one of those topics also that I think there's a big rural and urban divide because of resources and again, how kids come to the attention of the court. All right. And then I think that was it for our initial poll questions. We've got some other questions for you as we go along. So we really want this to be an interactive session. We are going to be asking you to write answers to some questions in chat so that we can kind of get a feel for what folks are doing. And so also so you can see how other people are thinking about this topic. So let's all keep an eye on chat. And we hopefully can have at least a little bit of a dialogue and interaction here as we go along. Now, we hope some of this information will be maybe a little bit challenging to your thinking. And so we just want, you know, everybody to keep an open mind. Sometimes, though, it can feel a little bit like you're the expert. And if you work in a court or a jurisdiction that is really knowledgeable about teen dating violence, and maybe you have your own specialized docket for it, it's really important that you're here too, because we know that we can talk and we can have our wonderful international expert Claire bringing this information to us, but also how things work in real life and how it works within the confines of an actual court. I think it's so important to hear from other folks that do this work. And so we're really hoping, again, as we're asking questions in chat, that the folks that have more experience, that you're sharing your point of view, and then everybody else is kind of reading those things and saying, oh yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. When we publish the webinar afterward, we'll publish the transcripts of those things as well. So if somebody posts something about like a really cool program that they're doing, you'll be able to come back to this and you'll be able to see it and say, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna do some Googling on that and find out some more about it. So that's what we're really hoping to provide for you today. Now, always we want to make sure that everybody understands the ground rules, and these should feel pretty typical to all of us as adults, learners and educators out in the world, that this is a safe space. We're happy to answer questions and have dialogues. And we're just really hoping, again, that everybody is here in that spirit of open and communication and sharing. Hoping everybody has a chance to be present. But I also understand that we live in a world where when we're doing webinars, sometimes we're doing other things. I'm hoping that you can at least come back to us a couple of times again to take a look at that chat, to see what other folks are saying. But if you're listening to this in the background, I hope something really sparks your imagination here and you're able to think about what you can take into your work that you maybe aren't doing right now, but something that's an easy lift, something easy to add, and then also start to think about what in the broad scheme of things you might want to do with this information. Who else do you want to talk to about it? What else can you do to make sure that, that we're really dealing with kids within the dating situations where violence might be present in a way that really makes sense within that context of adolescent development. And that's both for kids that are perpetrators and kids that are victims, because we know, again, with that adolescent brain, that adolescent responses are really, really important here. And we can't take the things that we do with grown-up victims or with grown-up perpetrators of like domestic violence and just slap that down on kids, because that's not going to work for them. So really, hopefully we can give you some ideas about how to move forward addressing this. All right, so let's talk really specifically about what we want to do today. We really want you to understand how normative adolescent brain development creates risks for teen dating violence. Again, this is about how the way that they make decisions, the way that their brains work, really make them vulnerable here, both, again, to perpetrate because of that, you know, kids are at that heightened emotionality. And when they make decisions, they make it from a different place in their brain than adults do. We want to talk about how there are also confounding factors here that can cause challenges and increased risk. So, you know, you're probably all familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Of course, people who have those adverse childhood experiences are more likely to experience all kinds of negative consequences as they move through life, and teen dating violence falls under that umbrella as well. And then we want to talk about how when you're doing interventions with kids, again, that adolescent brain requires different interventions, but relational interventions are really, really effective for kids. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Claire actually has developed something that is along these lines, so she can talk about it really intimately from that idea of how do you start with this idea that kids think differently and then develop programming that fits within that. And she also wrote for us this wonderful brief on adolescent brain development in teen dating violent cases. And the brief is not quite ready yet. It is out for approval at the Office of Violence Against Women. And once it is approved, we will be able to send you a link officially to it. It goes through, again, it's going to talk about some of the same things that we're going to talk about today. Maybe some of them will be in greater depth within the brief. And then we do go into interventions and advice for ways to approach kids that you'll be able to take and see. Now, everybody who's registered for the webinar, so all of you, but then there, if you have colleagues that registered but aren't able to attend, everybody who registered will get a link to the brief as soon as we're able to send it out. So don't worry about trying to figure out how to contact us for it. You're going to get an email probably in about a week, and we're going to say, hey, go get this, download it, check it out. It's really cool. And you see we have some great graphic design going into it as well. So we're excited about that. All right, now I think that's all of my spiel here, and now it's time to turn it over to Dr. Claire Crooks to really get into it. Claire, I thought you could talk more about your background, since I just really talked broadly about you.
All right, thanks, Jess, and thank you to the National Council for organizing this today on a really important topic. And I'll add my welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to see the wide range of roles that people play, because spoiler alert, if you work with teens in any capacity, then you do work with teens who are affected by teen dating violence. We just know that from the prevalence numbers, and that really, when we talk about the most effective responses and relational responses, what becomes clear is that there's no one role or one professional or educators or that can do this all on their own. So it's terrific to see such a wide range of people involved with this today. So as Jess mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm registered in clinical school in forensic psychology, and I'm a professor at Western University in Canada. And I've been involved with developing and evaluating and implementing violence prevention and mental health promotion programs for over 20 years. And a big focus of that has been on adolescent dating violence and family violence as well. And I've co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles. And so really saw myself as quite an adolescent expert. And I will say there's nothing to reduce that feeling, like having the two of my oldest children hit adolescence and realizing that actually you never feel like an expert when you have teenagers in your home. But that's just a little bit about my background. And actually, one of the areas I'm doing a lot of work in over the last 5 years has also been about adapting evidence-based programs for different groups of youth, and thinking a little bit about how we bring equity and sort of a concept of intersectionality into our work as well, instead of trying to force one-size-fits-all evidence-based practices into different contexts. So just to start, we just wanted to get people thinking a little bit. When you think of adolescents or think of teenagers, and you can just type some answers into chat, what are some of the typical characteristics and behaviors that we think of when we think of adolescence?
Boy, Claire, I got to tell you, I really relate to you. I have a 15-year-old, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Moody, yes, impulsive, risk-taking, immature, sensitive. I love all of these just one-word answers: attitude, guarded. And some of them, I like this, that we're seeing a mix coming into chat of kind of positive characteristics like funny, and sort of those kind of more negative things that we think about with kids. Claire, what are you seeing that's really standing out to you?
Yeah, I love seeing that balance. There's certainly some things that we think of that are front of mind, but also some of the things like creativity, peer focus, those are all things that we're going to, I can connect in today to what we're talking about in terms of how their brains are changing. certainly being bold, risk-taking, sometimes impulsive, also sometimes more thoughtful and shy,
I
sassy.
like,
Yes.
I've seen a couple talking about like looking for a voice or forming their identity. And I think when we
Mm-hmm.
think about dealing with kids, that's such an opportunity for us
For sure.
because they're trying to figure out kind of who they are. And if we can help them see themselves in that different way, we can really help influence how they end up, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
they become as adults. I've also seen a lot of like peer influence and not good at the
Mm-hmm.
long-term consequences of behavior, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is really germane to the discussion today.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent.
They look and sometimes act older than they are. Yeah, that's I think for adults that's one of the hardest things for us
Mm-hmm.
is sometimes they present like they are mature and know what's going on, and then they'll do something where you
Yep.
realize that, oh no, this is still a child.
Yeah, and I think if you want to go to the next slide, Jess, I think um, when we think about adolescence, really, it's this time of incredible transition. So you go from being a child in a relatively short number of years where you're supposed to be able to take on adult roles and decision making and really be independent in a whole lot of other ways. So there's this intense transition that needs to happen. And during this time, we see this rapid physical and cognitive growth. And we're going to talk a lot about the brain growth today. But even some of the things that people mention in terms of even the way that teens may seem more confrontational, or they're developing these new abilities to sort of think about different sides or see shades of gray, where maybe when they were younger they saw things more black and white, and they're able to see more nuance in some of those kind of issues that can lead to them being quite argumentative, because they can always see like another side to what it is you're trying to talk about. We see this emerging focus on intimate relationships. So that can include things like sexual and gender identity as well, really becoming clear, and starting to navigate how do you express interest in somebody? How do you kind of how do you understand and navigate consent? All these things that, again, you don't really need to understand the same way as children, but by the time you're young adults, you're expected to sort of understand. Peer groups become very salient. So up until early adolescence, the family tends to have more of an influence, socializing influence. Into adolescence, that really shifts to peers. Although there's also good data to show that parents and families and guardians and other important adults actually continue to exert more influence than they may feel like they do sometimes. So that's an important message for guardians and other adults, that even if it feels like your adolescents aren't listening to you, that there's still an important role in terms of having those conversations. But
Uh-oh. Have I frozen or have we lost Claire? Heather, are you there?
I am here, Jessica. It looks like Claire has
and
frozen.
Hey,
Oh,
Claire,
there she
you
is.
froze for a minute there for us. Is your
sorry,
internet connection back up?
can you hear me now?
I
Yes.
can. So
Yeah,
if you could,
sorry.
that's okay. If you could rewind about 30 seconds or so, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Just talking about how peer groups become so much more important, but it's more than just peer pressure. Sometimes we talk about peer pressure as sort of, it's one aspect of it, but even peer relationships become more challenging when you try to figure out, when peers confide in each other if they're struggling or having a hard time or in an unhealthy relationship, and then you have to figure out your role, and do you try and get help, do you try and be a support, and so even some of those things, if you have a friend who's acting in ways you don't like, how do you kind of be an effective bystander? Again, all things that the adults also struggle with, but certainly more complex for youth. And then this real identity exploration that a few people talked about too, um, uh, in terms of figuring out who you're going to be, and for kids who've not had a super like healthy and safe childhood, it can be challenging, because you're also having to maybe figure out ways that you want to be that are different than the ways that you were exposed to or what you saw growing up. So lots going on during adolescence, and it really happens in a short time. The other thing about all these areas of growth is they don't necessarily happen in step with each other. And you see, it's not a linear path. So there's a couple comments about that, how you can seem really independent, and then the next moment, you know, my 13-year-old wants their back scratched at night, or like you can kind of see this back and forth as they're navigating these boundaries and this new independence. But you can also see that certainly kids can physically mature way before they're socially mature, or they may be kind of socially quite nuanced, but still developing their cognitive reasoning. So you see this sort of asynchronicity in the different areas of development that can be challenging. Yes.
And I see in chat, there's a question that is sort of specific, but I think is germane to some of that conversation. So I want you to touch on it a little bit. Sean Dowell says that they work in a juvenile detention facility and the staff have a difficult time understanding brain development due to some of the very serious charges that the kids have. And within a dating violence relationship, I think sometimes there's serious enough violence that happens there that it can feel really hard to kind of go back and remember that this is somebody whose brain isn't completely developed and who is still a child. How do people navigate that?
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that when we talk about the impacts on brain development of trauma. And also when I'm going to talk a little bit about the program that we developed and that we implemented in juvenile justice in another province. And most of the youth in that facility were there for death-related incidents. So it was with quite serious offenses. And I can talk a little bit about our experience with that. But I think let's come back to that. You can remind me at the end if I forget to connect that, Jess.
Sounds great.
So when we think about this complexity, and there's so many bits and parts to being an adolescent, what are some of those things that might make youth vulnerable to dating violence?
Yeah, so out of all of that list that everybody just gave us in chat, kind of what are the ones that we think are most likely to be associated?
Yeah, so not knowing what is and isn't normal, domestic violence between parents. So again, role modeling and things that they've seen, how they see themselves as they're navigating this identity. People are recognizing that exposure to trauma plays a big role for sure.
Low self-esteem, I see coming up alcohol, somebody who's innocent or naive.
Yep, peer influences, how self-regulation, and I'll talk about that a bit. We talk about brain development and how that develops, unclear boundaries, certainly the experience of trauma and disrupted attachment. And just some of it's just the education around what is healthy and what's normal and not normal. And it's interesting when we talk to teens in research about what is healthy and unhealthy relationships. One of the things that they as a group consistently see as a sign of very positive and healthy relationships is extreme jealousy. And so that's something, again, where some education and some clear messaging from adults and other mentors is really important, that having someone that, demands having all your passwords to social media or that checks in on you 50 times a day is not a sign that they just love you so much, but a sign of more coercive behavior.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm seeing come in is this idea that people are looking for a place to belong, a sense of belonging. And so I think that goes to that idea that sometimes if you're a victim of dating violence, you're more likely to kind of stay if you're looking for that feeling of this is where I should be, even if there are some real negative side effects to that.
And the other thing is, especially in earlier adolescence, the dating relationships and peer relationships are often so entwined that if you want to end a relationship with a dating partner, you may actually be giving up your whole peer group as well. And it's not only not like an adult divorce where maybe you're going to lose those friends that came into the relationship with your partner, but the peer group can also really mobilize to be very negative and hostile and harass. So it is that kind of entanglement with peers as well, and what might happen if you end a relationship. So, so the one thing I'm not sure I saw here that came out really clearly earlier, some of the pieces around the impulsivity and the risk taking and immaturity and cognitive immaturity in terms of how their brains are still developing. So, age, development, stressors, environmental influences. Really nice job too, identifying that it's not just like the individual or their peers, but also the messages from popular culture and the gamification and media and pornography. All those things also play a role. So great. So our next question is, what age do people think that rapid brain development stops? When we talk about the teen brain maybe being under construction, when does rapid brain development stop?
People are answering so fast. Flowing down. It's like listening for microwave popcorn, watching poll results. Mm-hmm. All right, so Heather, let's go ahead and show everybody the results.
Great. Yeah. So actually, it's a bit of a trick question because there is very rapid growth in the first 3 to 6 years. But what we now understand is that brain development actually does go quite rapidly right up to the mid-20s. And that's really good news because it shows this accelerated period of, and we'll talk about this, kind of the way the brain rewires and shapes itself continues right through the mid-20s, which means we can form new synapses across this period. You can develop new synapses or connect brain cells differently across the whole lifespan, or we'd never be able to learn anything new. So as we age, what we call neuroplasticity, or like the ability of the brain to wire and rewire itself, slows down. So things take longer to learn. And again, as a parent, I know that because the kids will show me something on social media, or and I still have trouble consistently using our remote control to turn on our television. But you can teach an old dog new tricks, which is different than we used to think in terms of our understanding of brains. So up to the 20s, there is this rapid change in brain that creates a really exciting opportunity for learning. I just want to take another minute here too to talk about how the brains develop across childhood into adolescence. So brains build themselves from the bottom up. And we talk about this quite a bit in the technical assistance brief. So you can reference that when you get it as well. So that means that you have different parts of your brain, and sort of the most primitive parts of the brain actually start first. So we talk about the amygdala, which is kind of your threat center. So that's this kind of instinctive response, and it drives the fight, flight, or freeze response. And that actually develops before the upstairs part of the brain, and that's we call it sometimes downstairs, upstairs. So that's the more primitive part of the brain. And in adolescence, it grows, and so adolescents can be more attuned to threat, and that often can even be that kind of interpersonal sensitivity that you see, where sometimes teen brains kind of see hostility where there isn't any, and then we also see. And then there's a hippocampus, which stores a lot of memory, particularly nonverbal memory. So that's developing in step. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, develops last, and that's the part that has reason, decision making, language, executive functioning. Those all develop last. So when we see that, say that teen brains are a bit different, some of this kind of threat response center, and this is just in all teenage brains, and then we're going to talk in a few minutes about how this is shaped really powerfully by experiences of violence and trauma. But even in a typical teenage brain, or not typical, but a non-violence exposed brain, you do see this kind of misstep where the amygdala and the kind of scanning for threat and hostility develops a lot faster, and the prefrontal cortex is slower and takes longer to develop. And so you can see that partially as things like increased impulsivity or risk taking, because these two things are a little bit out of step. So so the importance of adolescent brain development has hit our radar in a big way over the past few years, but there's also still some real persisting myths about it. And so I want to show you a great video from Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist that's really helped bring neuroscience to a wider audience. And what I like about this video is that it captures brain development from a more positive stance in terms of some of the incredible opportunities that are made possible by the way adolescent brains change from their previous childhood brains. So go ahead with that, Jess.
The adolescent period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message and they make it so there's nothing we can do. So what is actually the truth? The truth is that instead of raging hormones, what's happening is we have remodeling in the brain. In ways we never could have predicted, we now understand two big things are happening in the brain, things you as an adult can support adolescents in developing well, and if you're an adolescent, you actually can use this to help your brain grow in an optimal way. What are those two things? The brain is pruning itself. So imagine that in childhood, you're growing like a tree and establishing all these branches and all these leaves are growing. In the brain, that means connections among the basic cell, the neuron, called synapses, are being established. And you're soaking in the knowledge of the world, and that's beautiful. The tree is just growing, growing, growing. But then what happens that surprised everyone is the brain begins to prune itself. You start carving away some of those leaves, some of the smaller branches, even some of the larger branches. And the reason for the pruning is to specialize the brain. While the child is developing in ways that are really generalized, learning everything they can about everything they can, an adolescent is going to begin to find their passion, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle underneath it. That if you don't use something, you're going to lose it. So if you like sports or like dancing or like music, do those things so you continue to establish those circuits. The second thing that happens in the remodeling adolescent brain is myelin formation. Myelin is a healthy sheath that allows connected neurons to communicate with each other in a much more effective way. How? It's 100 times faster, the signal that's sent down a neuron to communicate with another neuron, 100 times faster, and after it fires off, it's 30 times shorter the resting period that happens. 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you've put down myelin, you've made your neurons communicate 3,000 times more effectively. That's a great thing. Now, the great thing, too, is that you as an adolescent can actually use the focus of your attention to be aware of your emotions, aware of other people, to be engaging in activities, to be doing things with your thoughts that actually reinforce the parts of your brain you want to hold on to. So the good news about the remodeling story is that a field called neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience, shows us that what you do with your mind can change the activity and therefore the structure of your brain. So if you then come up with the statement that the ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to make an integrated brain, to differentiate areas, that's the pruning, and myelinate them, that's the linkage. When you increase differentiation and linkage, you make the brain more integrated. And an integrated brain is the pathway toward well-being. And you can do mind-sight exercises. These are exercises that increase insight, empathy, and integration. And if you do them as an adolescent, and you can also do them as an adult, you'll actually increase the integration of your brain as your brain is growing, not just during adolescence, but throughout the lifespan. And what's the outcome of integration? When integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And so what we see through adolescent development is that our relationships become built on connections that are deep and filled with honoring each other's vulnerability, that's kindness, and supporting connections that are compassionate, filled with a sense of caring about other people and wanting to help them. This is the kind of world we can build as we move through life and support each other in our development.
Okay, so so Dan Siegel has a foundation, and his focus is on kindness and compassion. So that's the angle he's taking. But in terms of like just that story of the teenage brain and how it's similar or different from other stories you've heard, you know, what, and maybe just type in anything that kind of jumped out as they're different than the way you've understood teen brain development before, or some connections that you made in terms of kindness in the adolescent brain. All right. There's some fast fingers here.
Oh, you can practice it. I think that's a really important thing to think about when we're dealing with kids, is that they can learn to do this better.
Yep. Yep. So somebody's mentioned the dopamine challenge, which I'll come to in a few minutes. So lots of comments here about being able to see this in a more positive lens and some of the opportunity for growth. And I know that's really challenging when you're also thinking about day to day. I'm remembering the earlier comment about when you work with kids who have potentially perpetrated really serious violence and hurt others. How do you balance these out? And so we're going to come back to that. But yeah, that use it or lose it phenomenon is really important. And that idea that compassion and kindness can be taught, and that a well-integrated and well-regulated brain is a really important step in that. Yeah, a nice comment here from Danielle about the importance of partnering with teens or youth in their brain development, and in all our practices with them, that kind of approaching them as collaborators, as opposed to us being the adult experts or kind of the punishing force and telling them what they have to do. Yes, great, good. So then moving on, and when we think about adolescence, then we're getting this idea that there's this tremendous neuroplasticity where brains are changing based on what they're exposed to, and that peers create both an opportunity for growth and negative influence. So, for example, we know from research that adolescent boys who hang out with peers that engage in hostile talk about women are more likely to engage in dating violence perpetration, all other things being equal. So negative peers can really contribute to vulnerability, but the same way, creating opportunities for youth to spend time and learn from pro-social peers can help them learn new skills, be exposed to new perspectives, see different types of ways to regulate their own behavior. So peers are both a potential risk and also, again, another opportunity for growth and intervention. The other thing that we know is that relationships are very interesting to adolescents. So it's also a really nice window for intervention, because youth want to talk about dating and consent and whether someone's a good partner or not, or that there's a lot of natural interest in that. And for me, when I think back to when I was a teenager, we had like the youth magazines, like YM magazine, and there was always these quizzes on the front. Is he boyfriend material? What does his mother really think of you? Are you a friend who gives too much? And you could do these quizzes and find out all the relationship secrets. And so I think that was capturing the same thing. And now there's lots of online quizzes, but this idea that youth really want to think about this and talk about it. They want to compare themselves to their peers and kind of see what other people think about things. And so that creates a really great opportunity to talk about these things and to help support youth to think about them in different ways. The other thing, again, with this change is that we need to not sort of pigeonhole youth too early, that, oh, this youth is a victim of dating violence or a perpetrator, and they're always going to be that way, because there is so much change within their development and their brains. And then you layer on the susceptibility, for better or for worse, for peer groups, and there's just so many opportunities to change trajectories in terms of how youth are developing. So unfortunately, the plasticity of the brain means it's shaped for better or worse by experience. So for children and youth exposed to chronic stress and violence, these forces also shape the brain through these same pruning and myelination processes. And I'll come back to this after a video, but the idea that if you think about this idea that it's a use it or lose it principle. So if you have lots of opportunities to regulate your own behavior and to be supported to do that, those self-soothing and self-regulatory pathways are going to get stronger. So when we think about from the time children are very small, and why infant attachment is so important, that when youth cry because they're hungry or scared or whatever, when an attachment figure comforts them and soothes them and holds them and helps them co-regulate their behavior, that's those pathways in the brain start to get strengthened, and that happens all across childhood. Whereas if youth are not in that kind, are either experiencing neglect or harm, where there's this activation, chronic activation of fight or flight or threat arousal without an opportunity to do the self-soothing and self-regulation building, then unfortunately the pathways that are going to get kind of sharpened and more efficient are going to be those danger-based pathways. So I'm going to show you a quick video now that talks a bit about this, but again, some of the optimism or some of the strategies that can counter it.
The emotional effects of childhood trauma are well known, but new scientific research reveals that a child's positive and negative experiences can shape and reshape the brain. Research suggests that the more a child witnesses violence, the more neural connections are created in regions of the brain that involve fear, anxiety, and impulsiveness, while fewer are created in regions that involve reasoning, planning, and behavioral control. The good news is the young brain is malleable or plastic, and fostering stable, supportive relationships can prevent or help reverse this damage, resulting in lifelong benefits for the child's learning, behavior, and overall health. So how can you help a child in your life? Just remember these 5 healing gestures. Celebrate them with a compliment or by applauding their efforts. Comfort them by staying calm and patient. Listen to them and show an interest in their passions. Collaborate with them by asking their opinions. And inspire them with new ideas. With these everyday gestures, you can help a child look forward to a bright future.
Great. Yeah, and you know, that's some of the comments people made earlier about approaching them as a partner in their brain development or their development in general, or expressing interest, or youth can be very insightful when you listen. Those are all echoed in that short video. So now, just a quick opportunity for people to type in. Was there anything that surprised you about that video, in terms of, or any aha moments in terms of how exposure to violence and trauma gets in the way of optimal brain development? Okay, so I want to connect a few dots here. So I talked about how different parts of the brain, how the brain wires from the bottom up, right? So this amygdala, the threat center, develops kind of first. And then the prefrontal cortex, that PFC, which is like the wise owl part of your brain, takes longer to develop. And so the way that our brains are designed, even in full formed adult brains, under threat, we can circumvent our prefrontal cortex. And this is a really, really important concept. So it makes sense if you think about this. Our brain is designed so that if we're faced with that proverbial tiger, our amygdala can mount a fight, flight, or freeze response in milliseconds, because it doesn't make sense for our prefrontal cortex, our wise owl, to kick in and make a list of possible actions, pros and cons of each action. Think about the things, how do we think the tiger's feeling about this? Like, those are all things we want people to do when faced with conflict. But in a true threat, when our amygdalas are threat activated, it doesn't make sense to do that kind of thinking from a survival or instinctive response. We need to act in milliseconds under true danger. Okay, so the problem is that our amygdalas can be activated by danger, like a tiger. They can also be activated by perceived danger. Emotional harm, kind of hostility. And so again, when we think about this idea of this use it or lose it, children and youth who have had so many of these experiences over the years, this amygdala activation really becomes very myelinated. Remember, that 3,000 times more efficient because the signals travel faster and the refractory between signals is smaller. So we are really creating this super highway of threat response. And we see that in youth we work with, where just the littlest thing can like set somebody off and they go from 0 to 100 and what just happened there. And that is that experience and the way that it's influenced their brains. So it can be really problematic for children and youth who have been exposed to chronic threats and stressors over the course of their development. That's the discouraging part. Again, the more promising side is that there is still this period of being able to kind of wire and rewire brains. So yes. And so somebody's commented about exposure to difficulty. So does this mean that we do what's been labeled like snowplow parenting, or maybe that's just a Canadian expression, where our job as parents or caring adults is to push anything negative out of the way so that our little our little flowers can just blossom? And that we know that's not good for youth either, that it's about having a kind of developmentally age appropriate challenge. And there's a difference between sort of normative stress, which is like having to get ready for a math test or something, and then kind of more toxic stress, which is where there's not breaks between the stress, or the magnitude is just too big for youth to be able to mount a response. And really, when we start to talk about things being traumatic, it's the point at which that adversity has overwhelmed an individual's ability to cope and respond. And that's where an event can be traumatic. So, question about video game violence, and has the same effects and consequences. Yeah, so it's a really interesting field, Jennifer, and the idea that probably it's probably a little bit bidirectional. So kids who've experienced trauma and violence are probably more drawn to some of the violent video games and than their non-exposed peers, and it probably has a bigger influence on them as well, and that kind of flooding. And then also there's a big impact on dopamine, which I'll talk about in a minute. So. Yeah. So let's go to the next. Okay.
The other question I saw was somebody needs to know whose video that was we just watched. And I might have cut off the very beginning that told us about that. So can you tell folks where to find that video if they want to show it to other people?
I think that's just the Harvard Developing Child Project, I think, but we can include the link, and they're freely available. And there's a bunch of them that are quite excellent, quite related. But I can't think of what the project's called off the top of my mind, because I don't have an adolescent brain and I don't hold new information as well anymore.
That's okay. When we send out the link to everybody, then with the brief, we'll include links to the videos too. So you guys will just get a little nice package. Okay, great. So again, this impact of trauma, these fight or flight pathways become reinforced. And when we say reinforced or myelinated, they become superhighways. So we all have superhighways in our brains, the responses that we do automatically, and that any change requires that kind of conscious effort and slowing things down. And even if we're making changes, so suppose we're trying to eat less sugary carbohydrates, that it's going to be easier for us to make better choices when we're not activated, when we're feeling calm, then in that moment where your boss just spoke in a really negative way to you, and you walk out at lunch and go eat 3 muffins or something. So it's similar that when you're activated, it's harder to make those changes because those brain pathways are so fast. And so chronic exposure is particularly harmful because it's been happening their whole life in different ways. And we know that it's not just chronic, but it's that dosage. And again, Jess mentioned the ACEs study in the beginning, and we decided not to talk about it here today because we think that by now people are pretty familiar with it. So that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, if you're not familiar. And it was the first one to show in about 17,000 people, big
sample, that when you look at the number of trauma and related adversities people experience, it's the numbers, the cumulative impact more than any one. So we know that being sexually abused is not great for development. We know that being neglected is not great for development. We know that, having a parent who has alcoholism is not great, but it's when you start to stack those. And what several decades now of this work has shown is that as you mount these cumulative stressors and trauma and adversity, you see this exponential growth in almost every negative outcome we can think of. So that includes things like behavioral outcomes. So number of sexual partners over life, IV drug use. It also includes mental health outcomes, depression, suicidality, like almost everything, and even physical health outcomes like ischemic heart disease. You see this huge adversity or this huge exponential growth. And again, I think we've seen this for a long time, and that we see that the brain development is helping us sort of understand some of the pathways. And so a question here about how we kind of rewire this, and we're going to move on to that for the last half hour of this webinar, because there is this opportunity. And again, as it says here, safe and healthy relationships are key to strengthening these underdeveloped areas. So we talk about brains being sensitive to the environment, and we used to think about it things like lead exposure, like sort of primarily, but what we know now is the most salient feature of a youth's environment are the relationships. And again, that's why we understood that infant attachment was so important, but we didn't really understand the neurological basis for it. But that you see that in terms of brain development. And another great comment here from Mark, that this behavior doesn't go away just because someone turns 16 or 18, and so that's one of the reasons that the intervening during adolescence is so important, because once it's not that you can't make those changes later, but again, as you age, that neuroplasticity decreases. You've had more and more practice at developing these kind of superhighways of behavioral response and activation, and it does get harder and harder to change. All right, moving on. So yeah, we have this two-sided coin for adolescent brains. Not to overwork the point, that on one hand, there's this tremendous growth and learning that gives you this great opportunity for intervention and growth. On the other hand, they're not fully formed, and we know that reasoning and thinking are the last parts to develop fully, and under stress they're the easiest parts to ignore. So that helps us see some of that ambiguity we even see in teenagers, where they can explain something in a really nuanced way and be quite politically or socially engaged, and then other times it feels like you're talking with a toddler when they get really dug into something. But it can a little bit depend what part of their brains they're using and are active right then. Okay. So we want to move on and talk a bit about implications for intervening. So now that we understand this about brains, because if we say, okay, so now we know that exposure to violence and trauma and can wire brains in a certain way, I guess we're done. Then that's not a very hopeful stance, and it doesn't give us any direction of where to go. If we think of it more that the teenage brain it's not fully formed and it's highly sensitive, there are opportunities for growth, even for children and youth who have experienced a lot of challenges and adversity. So I'm going to go over about I think 3 or 4 and talk about a program to give an example of it. So the first one is this implication is that youth process information best when they're not activated. And this is actually true for adults too, but even more so for youth because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed. So you can see that where youth is really upset or actually kind of loses language, like they process it emotionally, but they actually have trouble finding the words or trying to explain their thinking or reasoning for, it's why it can be so hard for them to explain why they did something they did. So that prefrontal cortex is still under development. When they're overactivated and their amygdala is really sensing threat, then they can't even access the prefrontal cortex development that they have. And so one of the interesting things about this, when we understanding teen dating violence, is that idea of what constitutes threat, right? So we see in some adolescents really high rejection sensitivity. So when a partner ends a dating relationship, it's the most devastating thing, and that's perceived as a really serious threat, especially for youth who've had a lot of threat and violence. So it's important to remember that when I'm saying that they respond to threat, it doesn't just mean threat of like physical violence or you're going to get in trouble if you do this, but that perceived threat, which can be very much interpersonal. So one of the things we know is youth can best access their prefrontal cortex, that wise owl part of the brain, when they're in a calmer state. And so what that means is anything that you can do to create a sense of safety for youth will enhance their cognitive functioning. It'll actually make them smarter for that conversation because they can access their brains better, right? So anything that creates safety, predictability, and comfort will help. And so we can think about how we set up our systems, even in terms of how we do intake, do we take 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the beginning to kind of put youth at their ease and to make them feel more comfortable? Do we tell them what part of the system we're in and what to expect and what's going to happen next? Or do we leave them so that they have to scan constantly, that hypervigilance of scanning for threat or danger or not knowing what comes next? So it's really important we think about court-involved youth, or any youth in crisis, frankly, that their developing brains will work better, they'll remember more, and they'll actually make better decisions when they're not stressed. Okay, so this next one is that overly punitive responses do not lead to learning among adolescents. So during adolescence, the reward centers of the brain are much more sensitive, and this has to do a bit with dopamine regulation, than the risk assessment or punishment center. So the idea to gain something, whether that's social approval, whether that's a particular partner or money, or you see a lot of risk taking because the potential for reward is much more powerful than the possibility of punishment. And there's this difference in kind of dopamine circuitry and sensitivity that drives this. And it's one of the reasons that adolescents are so susceptible to sort of being addicted to video games, because that also drives a dopamine response and is very rewarding for them. So we see this increased dopamine sensitivity. So they're more likely to take risks or act in ways that look impulsive to us and to act without reflection. But what that means, it means that whole concept of like scared straight, it really doesn't exist in any meaningful way in terms of what we know about adolescent brain development. That focusing on punishment, it may or may not even shape behavior a little, but in terms of any kind of growth or aha moments or developing those capacities and skills that we want youth to have, that's never going to happen just through punishment alone. And part of that is we need to think, this is a bit philosophical, but we don't want, what's the opposite of adolescent dating violence, right? Like, what do we want for youth that are in our lives, personally, professionally? The opposite of adolescent dating violence isn't just youth who don't hit, right? The opposite of adolescent dating violence is youth who have the capacity and the skills for mutually respectful and beneficial and compassionate relationships. So that's what we need to focus on building. We have this incredible opportunity during adolescence where their brain development is so sensitive and they're really attuned to relationships. How do we teach these skills and capacities? And some of them are interpersonal skills in terms of dealing with others. Some of them are intrapersonal around rejection sensitivity or emotional regulation. But how do we teach these at this period of readiness so that as they move into adulthood, they have the skills they need to avoid dating violence and then subsequently other forms of violence as they get older? Okay. All right. So this should follow then that effective interventions are rooted in positive, healthy relationships with service providers and informal helpers. So human brains are wired for relational learning. It's how we're set up to learn. Both of those videos that we showed today talk about the importance of that kind of holistic and relational approach. So looking at youth as a whole person and their interests and their passions and their hopes for the future, and not reducing youth to just a problem or a symptom or misbehavior. And one of the things that we've come to learn is that relational contexts can even change the expression of genes. So this whole field of epigenetics has arisen, and it means that we now understand genes are like kind of like switches, and they can be switched on or not. So you can have a gene for something, but it may not be expressed if it's not, triggered. And so sometimes genes are triggered by things like viruses, but we're realizing there's a lot of genes that are expressed differently depending on the relational context. So whether you have a safe, healthy, secure attachment, for example, versus not, whether you have supportive and caring peers versus not, can change the expression of your genes. And I'll give you one example. There's a gene that sometimes gets called the vulnerability gene, or it's probably better thought of as the plasticity gene. And so it's 5-HTT-LPR, if people have heard about this. So it's a gene. And like any gene, you can have different versions of it. You can have 2 short alleles, you can have 2 long, or you can have a short and a long. It just depends on what you've inherited from your parents. And so this sensitivity gene or plasticity gene, depending on the version you have, can lead to being at risk for some outcomes in the context of particular experiences. So one example of this is we've known for a long time that, for example, adolescent girls who are exposed to relational violence, so that kind of rumor spreading and exclusion and gossiping and damaging of relationships rather than physical or verbal. So this relational aggression can raise the likelihood of depression in adolescent girls. And so, there's different ways trying to understand, well, why do some girls who experience this bullying get depressed and some of them don't? And there's other kind of risk and protective factors, but really interesting study that showed that depending on the form of this gene they had, that actually mediated a lot of the variability. So if you had 2 long alleles in this 5-HTT-LPR gene, then you were not likely to get depressed, even if you were bullied. And if you were had a short or short long, you were at increased likelihood. And so I think, again, we have to think about this as a society. What does that mean? Does that mean we screen genetically and say, oh, these kids are really sensitive and they're kind of like the drama queens and they're going to get really upset? And no, it means that we double down on the importance of creating safe and supportive relationships and experiences and opportunities for all of our youth, knowing that some youth have extra vulnerability, maybe because of their genetics, maybe because of their temperament and their personality, maybe because of previous exposures to violence, that all children and youth deserve and require these safe and supportive environments to have the best outcome. So being able to just go back for one sec there, just a final comment. This experiencing positive relationships is important in terms of, new skills being modeled and opportunities to practice and experiencing them. And something that's important to understand about modeling, we talk about modeling, how people learn from seeing other people and what they do or don't do. And a really important, so this is social learning theory, it's called. And an important part of understanding social learning theory is that people don't indiscriminately copy other people's behaviors in a situation, right? So just seeing somebody who hits other people is not going to make you hit other people, but people are more likely to copy behaviors that they see are effective in gaining an objective, right? So if we see behaviors that use power and control and violence in a negative way and are effective, then that's what people are going to learn. So this role modeling, it's so important for youth to see healthy, reciprocally beneficial relationships that still get people's needs met. And the nice thing about this is that everybody involved with youth can play this role. So again, youth are always learning, children are always learning. So this doesn't just happen in therapy or in a particular group for people who have perpetrated dating violence, that anybody who interacts with youth as an educator, as a mentor, as a mediator, as counsel, anytime that we are showing people other ways to get your needs met, and that means reinforcing other attempts to relate. So when we want to show healthy relationship skills, and we want to really praise and reinforce them when we see them, and show that they do work out. that's how social learning theory and role modeling helps to increase new behaviors. Okay, so relationships can be taught kind of in situ like that. So when youth are involved in mentoring programs and sports and other types of activities, they can also be taught really explicitly, because youth need these opportunities to learn healthy relationship skills. And for some youth, maybe this has happened their whole life, that their caregivers have modeled healthy relationships and talked to them about it, and their educators have, and their mentors and their neighbors. And some youth, we know, have not had that opportunity. And so it needs to be explicitly taught. And we talk about how, just compare how we teach reading, for example. So you think how important reading is, and we think, okay, we want all kids to read. So everybody in a community agrees this is important and does all kinds of things even before they get to school, right? And then once they're in school, we teach reading every year in the same, in an age appropriate manner. So we don't just teach reading once and then assume kids have it, can take it from there. We don't just wait till grade 5 and then try and teach reading and see see who's having trouble and throw services at them. Then we teach it every year, recognizing that for some kids that won't be enough. That for some kids that we can do our universal reading instruction, and they're still going to need some extra support or even some really specific intervention. So we kind of need to think about relationships and mental health that way. That we need to teach these skills, recognizing that even if we do that, there will still be kids who need more support going on. But the relationship skills can be taught. And part of that is even being able to discern between healthy and effective and unhealthy relationship behaviors. And somebody mentioned that earlier, even knowing what's healthy or unhealthy. And the example I gave, knowing that expressions of extreme jealousy is not a sign of healthy relationship and commitment. And that we can break skills down into small pieces and practices, and they can get feedback from each other. So again, the way we would teach basketball, you would never just have kids read something or watch a video about basketball and then put them into a game situation, right? We break these skills down, we practice without any defense, and then you practice with defense or resistance, you get feedback from other people, and we can teach those, and we can teach those healthy relationships. So one of the programs that we've been developing on the next slide for a long time, we have a whole series of programs called 4th R, and the 4th R is this idea that relationships are as important as the first 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. But we have a small group version called the Healthy Relationships Plus program, and it's and we have an enhanced version that we developed and piloted in youth justice settings in Canada and evaluated. And I just want to give some examples from that. There are other programs. We list a number of programs in the technical assistance brief. There are not many that have been implemented and evaluated in juvenile justice settings. Some, much more, are common, are school-based programs. But this is one that has been, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So the Healthy Relationships program is a 4th R program. As I said, this idea that relationships are as important as other forms of learning. I've just managed to obscure some of my screen, so I'm fixing this. And so all the 4th R programs have these 3 features of them. They're relationships focused for all the reasons we've talked about, because this is so engaging for youth. It's so salient for their development. It's a time of intense interpersonal growth for both peer and dating relationships. So the relationships focused, they're strengths based to be engaging and to help youth think about the kind of relationships they want to have and what skills they need to have instead of just what they want to avoid. And again, a real emphasis on skills. And so in these programs, we teach these skills. And going to the next slide, it's a small group intervention, about 16 hours. It's been attuned to trauma and higher risk contexts. There's lots of role play, lots of practice, and some flexibility around delivery. So we've evaluated this program in a number of different contexts now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did with youth justice in Manitoba. So on the next slide, when I talk about relationship skills, just to be clear what we're talking about, and these are the skills that youth learn and practice in this program, some of them are basic communication skills like active listening, assertive communication, delay, refusal, negotiation, help seeking, providing support, apologizing, ending a relationship, and coping skills. And I think what's interesting about this list is there's two things. So one is that it's not just like the emergency crisis skills of your friends in a dating is experiencing dating violence. What do you do now? But just these basic skills of how do you give a proper apology? How do you end a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a dating relationship you don't want to be in anymore? You have the right to do that. You also have some responsibilities around not trashing someone on social media or stalking them, right? So really, how do you break these skills down and teach those. This picture here is actually my oldest son, Finn. And, because I'm a psychologist, we talk about these kinds of things a lot. And I feel like I've been teaching them these skills their whole lives. Last year I came home and I had got my hair colored. And for people who color their hair, when you first get it colored, it's quite straight dark or quite extreme. So I came in and Finn looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, what'd you do to your hair?" And he and he's firstborn, so kind of a little bit, rigid and rule following. And he said, "Oh, your hair," and he was really quite fussed about my hair. And then he came to me later and he said, "Mom," he said, "I want to apologize. I feel really bad the way I reacted to your hair. I don't take change well, and it's a big change, but it looks nice, and I'm sorry." And I thought that was just such a nice apology, and clearly he's been taught how to do that by his father and I. And then the next day he came back again. He's like, "Mom, I was thinking about your hair, and I think I know where things went wrong." He said, "Because your hair actually looks really good. It's quite striking, and it looks quite youthful. And I think the problem now is it doesn't really match your face, because your face has wrinkles, but your hair looks really young. And I think that's what threw me." So part of being able to give a good apology is actually knowing when an apology should end, right? And realizing that even kids where people have talked about these and tried to teach these all the way along, that all of us could also use a little bit of coaching in some of these. The other thing I'd point out is some of these skills are actually quite complex. So we talk about something like help seeking as like one skill, and it's actually a whole bunch of combined skills. So if we say, if your friend is experiencing dating violence, you should get help for them. Well, that means you need to recognize there's a problem. So whether your friend is feeling depressed or whether they're experiencing violence, like you have to know what's normal and what's not, or like to recognize that. You have to be able to say to your friend, "I'm worried about you," which, again, teens are more likely to give advice or to teach teens to say how to support, say, like, I'm worried about you because this is what I'm seeing. And I think we need to talk to somebody, right? You have to know who to talk to. Is this the kind of thing that you go to a parent about or another caregiver? Is this a guidance counselor thing? You have to be able to start that conversation of why you're seeking help. And you have to be prepared if your first response results in like a crappy reaction from the adult you go to, how do you try again? So those are all things, for example, that we break down and teach in the program, because all of those little skills are needed to successfully seek help. So as I said, we've done this program in a lot of different settings with young moms, in child protection settings, schools, women's shelters. But we did do a mixed methods quasi-experimental evaluation of youth in a secure juvenile justice setting. And so the mixed methods means that we did surveys from them, and then we also did interviews and focus groups to kind of hear some of the stories in addition to the number. And quasi-experimental just means that because for lots of reasons, ethical and logistics, we couldn't have like a control group. So we couldn't say, you guys get the program and you guys don't. So what we did is we assessed them a month before the program started and right before the program started to see if there was change, and then right after the program, and then a month later. And we saw these improvements in assertiveness, self-control, empathy, problem-solving efficacy. So again, all these skills that you'd want to see. And we don't know if dating violence changed because they're in secure custody, and so they're not dating. And we also saw decreases in some of the things that we'd like to see decrease, like attitudes supporting peer conflict. And these were maintained at 1 month follow-up. And a number of these were also seen by the teachers who were rating them as well as self-report. So we saw these numbers, which is promising. And again, these are youth who have a lot of trauma. So I think probably a not dissimilar kind of presentation from what you would see in the US. In Canada, juvenile justice is heavily weighted towards youth with Indigenous heritage, but it would be similar to the overrepresentation in the US of racialized youth. And so we saw these changes we want to see, but beyond the numbers, we had these focus groups. And again, if we want to approach youth as kind of whole people and not just sort of the sum of their negative behaviors, we want to see their growth in their insight and their understanding and perspective and their skills and their empathy. So I just want to share 2 quotes from you again from youth who've gone through this program. So here's one saying, just listen to them, because that's one of the main things. People want someone to talk to without any advice or their opinion given. So that's what I try with my sister. She struggles a lot. And after the program, I kind of just started thinking about it, finding different ways to talk to her about it. So not just give her advice. I'll just talk to her on the phone about it and just listen to what she has to say. So that's like a small adjustment that anybody in relationship knows is actually kind of transformative, right? So again, our goal is to not just have youth that don't hit, but youth who know how to be in relationship in healthy and supportive ways, and in different types of relationships. And I think one of the interesting things about a relationships-based approach versus like a just don't do dating violence approach is that these skills and this perspective do show up in different types of relationships. So here, this kid's talking about his sister, but we had youth share similar experiences, talking about dating partners, talking about their caseworkers or people in the court. So when you start to develop these relationship skills, there's tremendous bang for your buck here because they can use them in different relationships. So next. I appreciate that a few people posted comments about my joke. The one problem with webinars is you can never tell if anybody laughed at your jokes or not. So thank you for the comments. So here's another one, again, linking together some of the other risk behaviors. When you do too much drugs and alcohol, you're not really in a clear state of mind and something bad could happen and you end up in a place like this. It doesn't just affect you. It affects a lot of people, like your family. If you assault someone or victimize someone, their family, it's just a big chain reaction or domino effect. So again, we're seeing this increase in sort of the understanding of the impact of behavior and empathy. All of those are really important precursors to then making different choices in future relationships. So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing with this focus on relationship skills. So I know that we're coming up to our last 15 minutes, and I wanted to open it up here in terms of whether anyone else has some promising relationship focused practices that are being used in their communities.
And Claire, while we're waiting for folks to type in chat with this answer, which I think we'll probably get a couple of really cool examples, I wanted you to see if you might address a little bit of this question that's in our chat box, which says, does the power and control understanding of adult DV apply to adolescents?
Yeah.
And I know it's a big question.
That is a big question. Sorry,
I'm just nutshell answer.
I'm trying to pull up the questions. Maybe I don't need to if I've got 2 monitors going here. I also, if anyone hasn't, I have a broken arm if anyone hasn't noticed, so I'm particularly slow with my, okay. Yeah. So power and control. So I think there's parts that fit in the sense that that if you have lots and lots of practice engaging in power and control behaviors, those are the behaviors that become myelinated. And so again, so that's why we see that it's hard to change some of these behaviors. But the more promising part is that adolescents have, again, this period of they're kind of experimenting with different types of relationships and behaviors and identity. So there's maybe more flexibility. And again, and probably some real skill deficits as well. And I'm aware I've done quite a bit of work with men who are abusive towards their children and partners, and it's hard because lots of adult male offenders also have these skill deficits, right? So so I think that the other thing about teen dating violence is we see a real heterogeneity, a real variability in terms of the types of patterns. So sometimes it's really just this kind of ineptness and kids trying to figure out how to navigate in relationships, especially in younger adolescents. And so it is a little bit of wrong place, wrong time, and they need some skills, but not. But we do. So I think we do see that kind of power and control type of offending even among teens, but it's a subset, and it's probably a much smaller subset versus some of these kind of more angry and aggressive and kind of dysregulated in all my relationships, or I'm still trying to figure out date. Like, there's this whole sort of continuum. And so when we work in teen dating violence, we need to really think about that context and understand that particular kind of incident or pattern when we think about our interventions, because we don't want to react to all teen dating violence as if it's this kind of coercive control or power and control type violence. But that means we also need to have good risk assessment and kind of an understanding of red flags for when it is there, because we certainly do see that, and we do see lethal violence in teen dating relationships that look more like the adolescent kind of coercive control type. So
it's a really good way to answer that in the nutshell. So good job. Thank you.
Okay. So somebody
Now,
here has mentioned about celebrating families, and I'm not super aware of that one. Jess, I don't know if you are, or if we want to ask Rosemary to say more.
I am not familiar with celebrating families for like this population, but I think it's a program that does something similar where you learn about how to communicate more effectively. And I think that I always think of it as being like helping parents learn to communicate more effectively. But I think all of these have that same sort of basis of focusing on relationship and communication and listening, active listening and reflecting, and all of those things that we really want skills for people to learn.
Yeah, and I think that idea that there is a window of opportunity, that some youth will be more motivated than others to engage in these programs. Certainly when you're involved with the court, you have youth's attention for that particular moment. And so this idea that courts can play the role of sort of mandating involvement in these activities or linking families is probably important.
I see
Safe
here.
Dates. Yep. Safe Dates is another one that, so Safe Dates and our 4th program probably have the most evidence as school-based programs. And I know Safe Dates has also been expanding with some offshoots for particular settings like shelters, women's abuse shelters. But that's another one that, again, teaches those skills. Restorative justice. And restorative justice is one, again, that can be really powerful. It needs to be done carefully. We don't want to just be bringing together people who've perpetrated violence, people who have experienced it, and sort of compelling them into getting along. But if we know the violence is stopped and that someone's taken some responsibility, there's a really nice opportunity to change the ending of that story moving forward and to make meaning of it in a different way. So that's we're certainly seeing more of that in different types of violence, including bullying. Yeah, so great question. And this is what I'm wondering for some of these, Jess, we might be able to point to other council resources. So if teens are less culpable, how do you help the teen survivor seek justice without losing faith in the system? Because that's one of these tensions, is we can talk about this and develop our empathy and compassion for teens that hurt people, that idea that hurt people, but remembering that these are not, victimless crimes or behaviors, and there's someone on the other side. So it is also balancing those things. And that in many cases, again, the needs are not dissimilar, that for both youth involved, in terms of developing relationship skills, having some accountability. So that's actually an important piece, that having some understanding of teen brains and the impact of violence can increase our compassion and make sure we want to meet all those needs. It doesn't reduce the need for accountability, and it doesn't take away the hurt to a victim of violence. So it is also being able to kind of hold both those things in tension. So we also have restorative justice, love is respect. Yep. Yeah, so there's a number of different resources, and just maybe when we send out the information after, I think actually, did you put some, I think you put some on the last slide, or no? We can add a slide with some of those levels of respect and such, and then of course the National Council often does institutes on teen dating violence, which are usually very popular.
Yes. And I think, when I'm looking at these lists, like the idea of restorative justice is a great idea. But again, when we're thinking about safety for the victim, a restorative justice model only really works if you, again, approach it very carefully and the victim feels comfortable being in that setting.
Yeah.
Too often, I think we take the victims of dating violence and sexual violence in schools and stuff and just kind of put them in a room with their perpetrator and say, work it out, kids. And that's the absolute worst thing we can do for those folks. We see out in the real world, most of the time when we have victims of teen dating violence, that they're being sort of referred to the programs that are within the community, the advocacy and other programs that are within a community for survivors of violence, dating violence, and sexual violence. Very few programs for victims that are really teen specific, but they cover a lot of those same things about healthy relationships. So I just wanted to make sure we address that a little bit. So I think we're right here at the end, and I appreciate everybody being so willing to share, and we will compile the chat so you can see all of the responses. We're going to add some resources to the email that you'll get, along with a link to this recording and a link to our final publication. So right here at the end, what I really want to do is for you guys to think about what you've learned today. And I want you to think about what's something you can do to integrate what you've learned into your practice. We know that you're more likely to do it if you write it down. So for those of you that feel comfortable sharing, if you want to write down one idea that you're going to take away and maybe change a little bit about how you're approaching things. And this could be something really small, like you're going to make sure that you're really being mindful and practicing active listening, or maybe it's something really big where you want to go and change your whole system. So if you can share that with us in chat, I really appreciate that. And I saw just looking in chat that we've posted our evaluation. So you might have seen that go by. What I'd encourage everyone to do is go ahead and just click on the evaluation right now and open that up in another window so that when we're done, you can just hop right over there and do it. It's a pretty short evaluation. It's just going to be a couple of questions. Gives us an idea of how to gauge things. Of course, since we're in the online environment, we're always really interested in how this information worked in this environment. So any feedback you want to provide for that would be great. So let's see what people are saying here. Being more sensitive to the young people that you work with. I like that. Talking about the teen brain development in a more positive regard. I love these videos, and I think all of them are available for you to use. And so I hadn't thought about using the videos with kids themselves, but what a great idea. They're so curious and interested in learning about this kind of thing to say, here's what I'm learning about. Do you want to take a look?
Linda Chamberlain's work on the teen brain, which we definitely reference and provide a link for in our technical assistance brief, has lots of great guides, but some are specifically designed for teens as well. And we think about that. We teach teens how their respiratory system works, how their digestive system works, but we don't actually teach them a whole lot about how their brain works. And yet we now know that very young children can actually learn that concept of, when my amygdala is fired up, I need to take deep breaths so that I can make better decisions. And so, yeah, it's great to share this.
Somebody here loves the idea of empowering youth. My 15-year-old, she thinks that in the school curriculum, we should really be talking about self-regulation and mental health much more than we do. And she's like, basically get rid of science and let's talk about this stuff instead. Which is funny. She likes science too, but she feels like for her life, this would be much better things for her to be learning. So
I think especially, there's a comment earlier about the pandemic, and I'm sorry I didn't get to that earlier. I think, as everyone sees, like the pandemic has done a couple of things. One, it has, if you think about how important connections are to youth, so it's reduced the connections for youth who are living in tricky situations, but maybe have their resilience is from some being out of the house a lot, or some of the other people they connect to. That's been hard. And then we know that the inequities of the system have also meant that, I've heard the expression that with the pandemic, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And so the resources people have, both like physical and financial resources, but even resources to safe and caring adults, is really inequitable. So all of the vulnerabilities have been very much exacerbated by the pandemic. So I appreciate that being raised by one of our participants today.
And so I just want you to go back, Sean popped it back up here in chat, to that question about how to help the staff in the detention center really understand more about the adolescent brain. So for our last minute here, can you offer some advice for Sean about some resources and some ways to help those folks?
For sure. So trauma-informed training that helps explain how brains work and the impact of brain, that can help. I think a big part of this is on workforce well-being as well, and burnout and the compassion fatigue of our frontline professionals, because when you feel put upon all the time and you're dealing with hard behavior, and you're experiencing the exact same thing of that kind of amygdala and activation of wanting to kind of punish, that instinct to kind of come back and control or punish children or youth's behavior is very quickly accessed for us. So it's one thing to teach about the brain and to try to, but I think anything that increases things like mindfulness practices or kind of well-being initiatives or connections, and helping, again, we want to teach teens how their brains work. We also want to make sure our workforce understands things like compassion fatigue and burnout, and how to improve that. And it's hard because some things are personal practices, others are kind of structural, right? Like those are actually really hard jobs, and we probably don't pay people enough to do them. And am I allowed to say that kind of thing, Jess?
I'm happy for you to say that.
So it is, because a lot of this is hard work. So when we work with staff, we want to increase their compassion for youth, but we also want to have compassion towards staff and what we're asking them to do, because it's hard to have teens get up in your face all day, every day, and teens can be really good at finding that thing that needles a particular adult. So,
all right, I think that's a great note to end on. So remembering that everything we're talking about is relational, the relationship between young people and other young people, but really that relationship between us and them, and then us and each other, how we can make sure everybody is safe and taken care of and has space to talk. So Sean, if that didn't really help answer your question, or you want even more resources, NCJFCJ actually works with this on a lot of different levels. So go ahead and send me an email or reply to the email that you got the link from, and that'll get forwarded on to me, and we can do more work with you. And that goes for everybody. If you have questions about teen dating violence or other things that are happening in the justice system, NCJFCJ is here as a resource for you. Please feel free to call on us. And with that, thank you all very much. I think it was a really interesting discussion. Appreciate all of your participation. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Claire. I totally forgot to say that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And so Heather, we can end the webinar now.